8A, we're going to look at something called hypothesis testing. So last class in our activity, we looked at Coach Rivers shooting free throws, all right? And he claimed that he was an 80% free throw shooter. And so we go out and he shoots 50 free throws, but he only makes 32 of them. That's 64%. Okay, so the question is Coach Rivers exaggerating about his free throw skills? A more technical way, what we really want to know is there statistically significant evidence that Coach Rivers is exaggerating his ability? Okay, he only made 64%. Was he just having an off day, or is he really not an 80% free throw shooter? Okay, and the process that for this is called hypothesis testing. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at now, is how to do a hypothesis test to determine if Coach Rivers is exaggerating his ability. Okay. So when we write hypotheses for a hypothesis test, we need two of them. We need what's called a null hypothesis, and we need what's called an alternative hypothesis. All right, so the null hypothesis is sort of the default belief. We're just going to assume that it's true. So we're going to assume that what Coach Rivers said is true. He is an 80% free throw shooter. All right, and then the alternative hypothesis is, what are we trying to test? Well, based on his shooting 32 out of 50, our alternative hypothesis is that he's really not an 80% free throw shooter. He actually makes less than 80% of his free throws. Okay. Hypothesis testing, a lot of times you'll hear it compared to the court system. So you are innocent until proven guilty. So the null hypothesis is that you are innocent. We're going to assume that you are innocent until someone can prove the alternative hypothesis, which is that you are guilty. Okay, and that's why when they read verdicts in court, they say you're not guilty. They don't ever say the person is innocent, okay? They say guilty or not guilty, all right? Because we don't have to prove that you're innocent, okay? We assume that you are innocent unless someone can prove that you are guilty. So in statistics, we assume that the null hypothesis is true unless someone can bring us data to prove their alternative. Okay, so for Coach Rivers' free throws, our null hypothesis is that he is an 80% free throw shooter. Our alternative hypothesis, all right, and what we're saying now after seeing him shoot, is that he is not an 80% free throw shooter. All right, so let's take those words and turn them into numbers. Okay, so our null hypothesis is that P is greater than or equal to 0.8. where P is the proportion of free throws Coach Rivers makes. So we are assuming that what he told us is true. He really makes at least 80% of his free throws. And then our alternative hypothesis is that he is less than 80% free throw shooter. And that's why he only made 64% in our little experiment. Okay, anytime we do hypotheses, your null hypothesis should have an equal sign. Okay, it could be just equal to, it might be greater than or equal to, it might be less than or equal to, but it should have an equal sign. So when we're doing hypothesis testing, here's the question that we're asking. How unlikely is it that an 80% free throw shooter would actually only make 64% of 50 shots? Okay, so if we assume Coach Rivers is an 80% free throw shooter, and then he goes out and makes only 64% of his shots, how unlikely is that? That is the question that we are trying to answer. If it's too unlikely, all right, if it's really unlikely that an 80% free throw shooter would only shoot 64%, then we reject the null hypothesis. Okay, that's the terminology there. Reject the null hypothesis and say that Coach Rivers is not actually an 80% free throw shooter. Okay, so again, here's the procedure. We're going to assume the null hypothesis is true. So we're assuming Coach Rivers is an 80% free throw shooter. We're going to collect sample data. He went out and shot 50 free throws, and he made 32 of them. Then we're going to calculate how unlikely our sample data is if the null hypothesis is true. Okay, and that is what we're going to do in our next video. I just want you guys to understand the procedure. Okay, and if your sample data is unlikely enough, all right, so if it's really rare for an 80% free throw shooter to make 64%, we reject the null hypothesis. Okay, if not, if it was just like just by chance, just a bad day, maybe on those 50 shots he had a rough time, but he really is a 50% or 80% free throw shooter, then the terminology we would use is fail to reject the null hypothesis. Okay, when we're doing hypothesis testing, there's two kinds of errors we can make. Okay, we can make a type 1 error, which is we reject the null hypothesis when it's actually true. All right, so we say it's not true, we reject it, but it actually is, and our data was faulty. Or a type 2 error, you fail to reject the null hypothesis when it is false. All right, so the USDA limit for salmonella contamination in chicken is 20%, and a meat inspector believes the chicken produced by a company exceeds that limit. When will a type 1 or type 2 error occur, and which is more serious? Okay, well, a type 1 error. So let's talk about what these hypotheses would be. All right, my null hypothesis here, okay, would be that the salmonella contamination, all right, is less than or equal to 20% because we're going to assume that it's safe. All right, and then my alternative hypothesis is what the meat inspector thinks, that the proportion is actually greater than 20% and the chicken is unsafe. Okay, so type 1 error would be I reject the null hypothesis. So I say that the chicken is not safe. All right, but it really is. So I say, let me add that in there. I say the chicken is not safe, but it actually is. Okay, and then a type 2 error is if I fail to reject the null hypothesis. So I say the chicken is safe. All right, I'm going to fail to reject. I'm assuming, I think this is still true. So I say the chicken is safe. All right, but it actually is not. All right, that is my error. I messed up my testing process somehow, and I said the chicken was safe, but it is not. That would be a type 2 error. Okay, which is more serious? It always depends on the situation. So I have to read what a type 1 error is, what a type 2 error is. It's not type 2 is always worse or type 1 is always worse. It depends on your situation and your hypotheses. So let's look at these two errors. If I say the chicken is not safe, but it is, all right, then the factory is going to have to go through some stuff and we're going to recall the chicken. So recalling chicken that is actually safe, annoying, expensive, okay? Type 2 error, I say the chicken is safe, but it actually isn't. So I let chicken that has too much salmonella go out into the world and get bought and eaten. All right, so in this case, the type 2 error, that's going to be more serious. I do not want unsafe chicken going out. All right, so again, which error is worse always depends on the situation, so you have to actually read the situation. Okay, so all of this was to answer the question, is Coach Rivers really an 80% free throw shooter? We got some more stuff to look at. We'll hit that in 8B.